Welcome to a unique video. Just wanted to test this out because I like Dead by Daylight, but I also really like Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, I don't play as much as I used to during Master Rule 4, but when there's new support I'm interested in, I give it a shot in Master Duel, but it left me to think, what types of archetypes would the characters in Dead by Daylight use? And this video is going to cover it for the most part, but first, I want to talk about the criteria and how we'll be doing this. An archetype, or sub-archetype, are a term to explain what a deck is. Things like Dark Magician and Blue Eyes White Dragon are archetypes. However, some decks comprise of multiple sub-archetypes that become one. A deck like Live Twins and Evil Twins work in tandem with each other but are considered separate, and we'll be using that for the ranking. Of course, one archetype per character to make it unique. But this made it quite hard for certain characters, but we'll talk about that later. And finally, their archetypes can be based on their individual powers, their film, and things like that. And when a character is shown, they'll have an aura around them. Green means I am very confident this deck is for them, and I wouldn't change it. Yellow means that there's some correlation, but I'm still a little iffy. And finally, red means I really couldn't get something that truly works for them, or I don't understand the material enough to give them the best archetype. You'll see a lot of the licensed killers and survivors. I'm not the best horror buff, admittedly. However, if you have any suggestions of archetypes for the characters I have decided, I would love to hear. But with that all said and done, let's start with killers. Also, by the way, every single song in this video is from Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel because I want to prove to a friend that card games should not go this hard. The Trapper I initially decided was the Traptrix. It works well, but ended up deciding to give that to another character and giving him the Sub-Terror. The Sub-Terrors are flip monsters, and usually target yourself or your opponent with effects, and then resetting themselves face down to be reactivated later. I personally really like the idea of the Sub-Terrors themselves resembling the Macmillan Mine, and one of the boss monsters in the deck, the Sub-Terror Behemoth Stalagmo, as a representation of the trapped miners in Trapper's Tome. Saw him as before they were mostly killed by him. I think this is the best option for him, except for, well, the obvious Traptrix. For the Wraith, I personally believe that the Skull Servants are up his alley, mainly in both theming with his Bone Clapper and the skull of his former employer, but that in Wraith's story we do get to see a kind side to him, which is for the most part the Waits and the Skull Servants archetype. It's just a big family of skeletons with quirky personalities. And I think that if Wraith got a choice, I personally think that a small story telling in the cards will draw him in. Another one I would choose is Ghostface, but since that's already reserved for another killer, Skull Servants it is. The Hillbilly was probably my favourite one to decide, because I knew it would be heroes. I would imagine the years he spent stuck inside the basement, he had little enjoyment, but I like the idea his legendary cosmetic says, well, maybe not the deep riff, but I can imagine him looking at the heroes in comic books and wanting to be like them, but of course, as he grew up, that type of life really wasn't in the cards for him. Which is why I chose the sub-archetype of Destiny heroes, to fit that whole twisted hero personality. The Nurse, although not being a traditional archetype, has its own way turned into one, and that is Nurse Burn, which I know is a little on the nose, but it fits her, at least the tome lore, where she tortured the ward patients while she worked there, and the burn effects from the cards can act like a representation of that. This was the first one where it was pretty hard to decide for good old Myers, as he doesn't have a personality we can really follow, mainly being a traditional slasher, so with the help of a friend and having to convince me for literally 2 days straight, we ended up deciding on Ghostface. They're meant to represent Halloween itself. The Ghostface are playful ghosts and ghouls playing pranks, which works in a way, but I still wish there was an archetype that worked for the embodiment of evil. The Hag was also difficult to decide on. Originally, I was going to choose spellbooks to represent the creation of the hexes that she uses, as she had to learn how to make them. But in the end, that was given to a survivor, and she ended up with an archetype that fits her well enough, being Traptrix. These are more directly flip monsters, using themselves to bring actual traps onto the field face down, and some pretty strong ones too, bottomless trap hole and things like that, and can be repeated multiple times, like the Hag being able to recreate her phantasm traps. And it also helps that they are usually in forests and swamps, which is the Hag's home realm in the game. I knew before even making this video that the Doctor was going to get psi-frames. The cards are either machines or people wearing them that crackle with electricity, and although we don't have any lore about them that I can find, I think they fit the Doctor overall demeanor, using electricity to torture his victims and even mangling his own body so he can optimally use electricity, being his own conductor. I like to imagine he's one of the synchro monsters. The Huntress didn't have anything too deep when thinking about it, which may disappoint some of you, but I do think that Amazon fits her the most. She lives in the forest and is a pretty tall Russian woman, and we know that she is strong, taking down an entire village and army squads in her tome lore, so a whole archetype of strong women, I think it fits her, but it's gonna be yellow. Bubba, sadly, doesn't have any decks that fit him as a character, so this was another one where it fits one personality and why it's in yellow, and that's Masked Heroes. How the deck works is you use the card mask change to slowly build up to stronger and stronger heroes. Obviously, the mask change in this example would be when Bubba wears the mask of another victim, that you used to be able to do in Dead by Daylight until it was removed for obvious reasons, which still sucks, but what can you do? And also, the masked heroes are usually either anti-heroes or sometimes villains, but it still works that way. For Freddy, I was thinking something between Volcanic or Infernity, and they both work rather well, but the playstyle of Volcanic works better in my opinion. I like to imagine in a Yu-Gi-Oh scenario, people are sent to the boiler room in their dream, and they have to play a shadow game with Freddy, where they slowly feel the burn damage pile up. Think of the Joey vs. Marek duel in the original series. That's how I like to imagine a duel with Freddy would be like, and the deck does work well for that. For Freddy himself, I think that Inferni works more, but the playstyle just doesn't fit him. The pig was really difficult, so she'll be one of the few red ones, but I ended up liking the concept of the archetype Arcana. This archetype works like the Arcana they're based off of, using coin flips for heads are upright and tails are reverse, respectively. The reason I like this for the pig is her method of her games. While Kramer had the belief of people being reformed from surviving the trials he put them into, Amanda deliberately sabotages them so they are impossible to win, and a card like Second Coin Toss will be able to copy that. Sadly, that's all I could really think of, but if you have any ideas, let me know in the comments, but for now, this is the one I'm going with. Alright, for the clown, there's literally an archetype that was made during the idea process called the Clown Clan, and because they're new, there's not much about them, but they do look pretty interesting. I might give them a shot when they come to the TCG, but I mean, it's pretty on the nose. The other one I could think of is Alchemy Beasts to represent his bottles, but they're already on another killer, so Clown Clan it is. The spirit was originally going to have Shiranui, but it was given to a survivor. Instead, I thought the idea of the Mayakashi was a suitable alternative, as the spirit herself is a yokai, being an Onryo. I also like the idea of the yokai in the archetype being her fallen ancestors, the obvious one being Yasha, a high-ranking general, and could be a representation of Renjiro Yamaoka, and Gasha Dokuro, a giant twisted form of a warrior, is his son. I won't lie, it's a bit of a stretch, but that's why this video has honestly been a ton of fun to make. The Legion was the hardest to give an archetype to since they're more than one person and have multiple different personalities. Originally I was thinking an idea with Charmers, they're 4 characters, 2 male and 2 female, but then once again I find out there's an archetype called Killer Toons in Japanese, and looking at them I can see it's easily working with them, but it's going to have to be a yellow, then a perfect green, due to me knowing very little about the archetype. They might be nice guys, but who knows. The Plague was one of the very few that I instantly knew who she would be using, and that is Ra, as it fits her lore and the sacrifice that she went through for the people of Babylon. I do think that the Phantasm Beasts or the Wicked Gods have a foothold as well. They won't be bad choices, but personally, Ra with its self-sacrificing of life points for effects just works better in my opinion. Now, the Dead by Daylight version of Ghostface is his own character, rather than one based off of the movies, so there's not too much lore to work with except that he's a reporter and a serial killer. However, if we go with how he usually is, messing with his victims before finishing them off, a deck that fully punishes people for simply playing the game would do the trick. And what better way than to make it so they can't play the game at all, introducing Kashtira. Now, they're not what they once were, but trust me, this deck was a menace back when it first came out, completely locking entire fields, making it virtually impossible to play the game unless you have a funny rock. And I think it works well for Ghostface, but once again, it's another yellow. Gonna say this now, but all of the Stranger Things characters I had a massive help with friends, as I really know nothing about the series, so they're all either yellow or red. But for the Demogorgon, I had a good idea for the most part, and that is the worm archetype. Mainly just a group of monstrous alien creatures. Fairly simple. I think that the Demogorgon could actually fit in with them with some tiny changes. Sadly, there's no dog deck, only dog bones. There's not much to really say about Oni's choice. I mean, Six Samurai, it's a very obvious reason why, and there's not really anything else. Ironically, I like to imagine Oni is the Six Samurai Shinai, because, I mean, he uses a Kanabo, and I like him just like how I like the Oni. Six Samurai have always been one of my favorite archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh! Mainly because it's an engine that can use cheese, but it still can be fun. With Deathslinger, the more I looked into it, genuinely the better it got. The archetype, the Magical Musketeers, is based off of a German opera, having a marksman making a pact with the devil, having 6 members, and each having a demonic hand. I really like the idea of it because the entity can be seen as the devil in Deathslinger's case, and offering him power to eliminate his foes. We do know the entity does interact with the character stories in one way or another, so this deck is a nice representation of that pact. Since the Executioner is more of a force in nature, I thought it would have been difficult to find an archetype that works, but nah, Twilight Swarm is pretty much another form of the Executioner. While the Pyramid Head acts as an enforcer for James's guilt, the Twilight Swarm are executors of the Punishment Dragon and mercilessly take down the forces of evil with any means necessary. While not the same form, they both end up having the same goal, at least if they're inside the entity's realm. The Blight is the master of alchemy. We know that much by his lore, add-ons, and the fact that he uses a serum of blighted flowers to give his powers, and infect others during Halloween. For that reason, the alchemical beasts would have worked quite well for him. Sadly, it's an anime-only deck, so chemical is what we've got instead. But it still somewhat fits, though it's quite ironic, because while Blight is considered the best in Dead by Daylight, the same cannot be said for this dead archetype. Now for the twins, I wanted to go with a deck that had something childlike for Victor, but something big and dangerous for Charlotte. And while for the most part it doesn't work one-to-one, as we don't know what the original Victor was like due to him dying, but I like the idea of Ojama Armor Dragon. The only thing that makes it yellow is the fact that Armor Dragon needs to level up to be at full power, than being a big powerful dragon from the start, but with the new support, that can be changed. The Trickster and Yunjin have sharing archetypes, but while she has the good side, the Trickster is different, using the evil twins. Both archetypes work together and are pretty much the same, but it unironically fits their lore, as the live twins are a front for the evil twins' dubious natures, being thieves, and while the Trickster has done things 1,000 times worse than elaborate theft, the live twin facade covered up by Yunji feels like the perfect cherry on top. The Nemesis was a tough one to decide on, but in the end I really liked the idea of the mutant archetype, reminding me of how he would slowly transform throughout the game, looking just as eldritch as the OG Resident Evil 3. But sadly, that's all the connection really is, and also it originates from a virus of sorts, but that's not enough for it to be red at least. Pinhead has probably the easiest one to decide on. That's simply just Dark World, which is quite sad because there actually is an archetype called Labyrinth, which could have worked, but instead of it being the same Labyrinth of Gate Guardians, it's an archetype with a tsundere queen warding the hero away from all the traps in her castle, so unless Pinhead is the tsundere girl of your dreams, it's Dark World. The artist actually has 2 decks that work, as they are both bird-focused decks, that being Raid Raptors and Blackwing. But in the end, I had to go with Blackwing for it to make sense, as in the 5Ds, the user of the deck's name was Crow, and a lot of the monsters and support for this archetype have black feathers, and are the closest to crows, so it works for the crows that the artist used to hunt her victims. The Onryo sadly cannot use the final countdown, as thematic as that card is, it has no support and isn't an archetype, unlike the Spirit Board, which in a way works out better. While the final countdown acts like the 7 days, the Spirit Board just straight up spells death in Japanese, and if it's a shadow game, probably would just straight up kill you. I mean, we saw what Bakura did to the kids at Duelist Kingdom, and that man gives no shit, and the Onryo would probably do something worse. Although the archetype doesn't have too much support, the most fitting archetype for the Dredge is Umbral Horrors. These shadowy, foggy creatures have unknown origins and are cloaked in a thick fog. That's given form, which for the most part is what the Dredge is. Add a couple zombie support and you've got yourself something close, but only enough to be yellow. The Mastermind is a yellow, but personally, I think the deck fits him a bunch, as the archetype is pretty much Resident Evil themed, that being Vendread filled with all sorts of mutated zombies, and even a core for the Vendread Scourge. You could even, in certain cases, say that it's Ouroboros. But once again, I'm stretching. But overall, this deck fits Wesker, and if anything, he's a Mastermind controlling the hordes to win a duel. The Knight also has one that's very obvious. While his guards are more mercenaries than knights, the Phantom Knights just works really well. I can imagine him having an army of spectral knights on his side. I do wish that there was a mercenary archetype, as it would fit more, but realistically, this fits both the killer and his power. The Skull Merchant was a hard one to decide upon, so it's another yellow, but I ended up liking the concept of Cyberdarks. It's a very cool archetype both in lore and in the anime. Honestly, Zane has one of the greatest character arcs in Yu-Gi-Oh! But regardless, the only other one that I can see is Ancient Gears. The whole rustic nature fits quite well, but I just like Cyberdarks just that bit more. The Singularity and Mech Lords honestly work the same, at least if we are following the anime lore that is. The Mech Lords caused a Terminator-level genocide of the human race that led to people from the future coming back to the past to prevent it in dubious ideas, to say the least. And I think that the Singularity can relate with his disdain for the human race and wanting to ascend beyond that, and for that, Mech Lords work quite well. The Xenomorph, while not having its previous forms in Dead by Daylight, I wanted their archetype to fit the evolution and decided that Ultimate Insect, while not being amazing, works well. That idea in mind, another archetype that fits that mold as well is the OG Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth, as it's received some neat support, and I also just like bugs, to be honest. The Journey, Chucky, The Unknown, and Springtrap have been in deciding their archetypes. Honestly, deserves to have them all put into one. For Chucky, he originally was going to have Fright Furs, as the idea of a cuddly teddy bear having something evil inside fit Chucky being the soul of a murderer stuck inside a doll. However, when Springtrap was announced for Dead by Daylight, it worked out being a crazed murderer inside a children's mascot outfit. Just worked out better for that idea, so then he got Gimmick Puppet, but then obviously the Unknown being some alien parasite that controls people's bodies and mimics human mannerisms to torment others works way better for him. So finally, Chucky got the one that honestly he should have gotten from the start, but I forgot was an archetype somehow, that being Shadow. While they're controlled by the essence of pure darkness, it can be said that Charles Lee Ray is a soul of pure darkness, if you want to be meta. So yeah, pretty much that's it. D&D Vecna is a being that wants to ascend into becoming beyond gods. Being an Archlich, he is immensely powerful to a point the entity had to nerf his power before letting him into his realm. While the archetype has some glaring weak points, one deck that represents the idea of complete power perfectly is Numerons, immensely powerful XYZ monsters that progressively get stronger until you're hit with a 100,000 wall that you must overcome or instantly lose the duel. Sounds hard, but he isn't immune to anything, so he can be destroyed really easily, but don't tell Vecna that. Did you know that there is an archetype for vampires? Good old blood-sucking demons from the pits of hell. And that would be a perfect archetype for Dracula if this was made before the Krasue came out. Unfortunately, nothing really works for her. Killer Tunes maybe, but from what she is, a being who hungers for flesh and blood, it's sadly the only archetype that works for her. This is the Krasue section, by the way, and she's also yellow. However, while lamenting on that fact, I actually found an archetype that I really love the idea of Dracula having over the generic vampire idea, and that is different dimension daemons. The reason why I like it more for Dracula is it feels more like the deck itself is an army that Dracula controls. We've seen him being able to summon various ranges of monsters and demons, and the fact that all of them must be summoned by a binding contract of darkness, being the Dark Lord, is a little meta, but I just really love the idea. Houndmaster, once again, is another character that has been inflicted by the sudden archetype arrival between my thoughts, and this one is Goblin Pirate, which is pretty bloody cool, because the art's pretty fucking cool. But for some added flair, she's gotta have Mescu Marin to represent Snug. When I was first thinking of Kaneki's archetype, I thought, he can't eat burger, hangry burger. And then Konami made it into an actually functioning fucking deck with novels and a retrain called Angry Burger. And sadly, it unironically fits for the most part. I mainly say this as the concept of the cuisines are made from demons, or we could say ghouls. Ghouls cannot eat human food but have responded well to things like coffee, so the idea of Kaneki having a deck that represents that part of his life works for me, but it's gonna be a yellow. And finally, Stranger Things Vecna, funny enough, actually ends up working to be a villain from Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, that being Yubel. From what I've been told, when Vecna was explained to me, he was changed by the Upside Down to be what he looks like in-game, and his goal is to merge all the worlds into one, which would end ours as a result. In GX, Yubel was altered by Seto Kaiba sending her into space. She's a card, by the way, because as Seto says,
"'Cause I figure, if there is intelligent life out there, then let's teach them how to duel."
When she returns, she wants to reunite with Jaden by using the card's super polymerization to fuse all of the worlds, and while during this fight, she becomes more and more monstrous. Do you kinda get where I'm going with this? They're completely different, but it's close enough for me to say that he would use this. And with that, the killers are done. Are you still standing? Are you still sane? I hope so. And if you are liking this video, please leave a like and a subscribe. And once more, if you have any suggestions, please let me know in the comments as we're going into Survivor and this list is full of reds. For Dwight, I decided to go with something that fits his lore, that being desk bots. These little guys are little things like pencils and rulers, becoming these little robots, and I think it fits Dwight. He's simply a low-ranking pencil pusher with a timid heart, while the desk bots are small but fierce robots. But it is a yellow, as there could possibly be something better out there. Meg, while mainly doing track, she is still an athlete. An ultra-athlete. Yeah, that's what I decided for her. There was others that could work, high-speed cars and all that, but they're more machines at their limits, while Meg strives to be the best at what she can do. Even if in her lore, life was bringing that down, she still tried to be the best athlete that she could be. And that's why I think that the UA fits her. Claudette is a botanist, and I couldn't think of any archetype better to represent that than the Natura archetype, full of colourful plants and animals. I think Claudette herself would really like the Maron. They're kinda cute, but yeah, let's be honest. Jake Park is one with nature and a survivalist, which would have made an easy slam dunk for him, but sadly there is no survivalist deck. Instead, Sylvan works somewhat, filled with all sorts of plant-like humanoids and beasts. I think it'd be something Jake would use, though at the same time is a yellow, but I give it bonus points that both him and Claudette could work in a tag team. As much as giving Nia the entity archetype would be funny for the joke, I ended up deciding on an archetype that I didn't know existed, and it somehow worked out way better, that being Punk, an art group that uses classical Japanese art to create creatures in a cyber world. Their pen themselves create these monsters, and the amount of petty crime Nia could get up to with something like that is kinda scary to think about. Maybe she really is the entity after all. I couldn't think of anything for Bill, so instead I decided to get meta with it, as before he entered the realm, he sacrificed his life for the survivors and left for dead. A noble sacrifice. So, to fit that idea, I wanted to go with something that used tribute summoning to pave the way for victory. And that archetype was Monarchs. In a way, the Monarchs themselves could represent the tanks and the cinematic charging forward and Bill's sacrifice. But of course, this is a red because it's just like the concept, and also I'm just making stuff up at this point. The same goes for Laurie as well. For her, instead, she has the Sky Striker archetype, because the character in the archetype is one singular woman against the world, mirroring the final girl trope in a lot of slasher films. She doesn't work with the lore or really anything else, unless you want to say that she's meta, like the deck was, but yeah, I couldn't think of anything else for her. Ace is a gambling man, so a deck comprised of poker-themed knights, which have been seen on the Pharaoh's deck, works pretty well to be honest. The funny part is that would mean that Ace also owns the Egyptian god Slifer. I just love that idea a lot. But to add on top of that, I think it would also run 3 copies of Jackpot 7 for a cheese win. Now for Fang Min's archetype. I had a hard time thinking about. I knew that she played MOBAs, thanks to her tome lore, and being a esports player, but I didn't know anything else than that. If anyone can help me find this exactly, please leave a comment below. But my friend, who is a massive lore nerd when it comes to DBD, told me that the MOBA she played was specifically like mechs and kaijus, which, ironically enough, there is an archetype in Yu-Gi-Oh! That is that exact thing, and I decided to go with it. If that isn't true, please let me know, but even so, the lore of the kaiju does fit the type of MOBA, so at the very least, it's going to be a yellow. While in his lore, David King is a boxer and a roughhouser rather than a wrestler, I honestly think it fits him as a person that the archetype is, well, the Dino Wrestlers. Gladiators also work in this case. Pretty much a lot of warrior archetypes work for him. He's very much that type of guy, and this was just one I pretty much knew instantly. I have not seen the reboot Nightmare on Elm Street, but from what I know in the film, Quentin develops his own counters to Freddy by controlling his sleep. So while Freddy's archetype was mainly on the film that I have watched, for Quentin, I wanted to give him Dream Mirror, as he is the good side of the mirror, peering into the nightmare that is Freddy's dream world. Honestly, either of the two can fit this, but I decided to give it to Quentin. For David Tapp, I knew his archetype was going to be some sort of detective or police officer. However, since Yu-Gi-Oh! Is sci-fi and fantasy mixed into one, there isn't just like the police. There's the S-Force, security from the future. While not exactly police officers or really investigators, they work well, especially with their role in Yu-Gi-Oh's lore to stop thieves and criminals. Kate was a difficult one. There are a lot of survivors that have similar lores, especially in music and acting, and so little Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes that have those things. Thankfully, I believe that Melodious fits Kate quite well. Light fairy monsters that uplift everyone with their songs, as well as a deadly OTK. And Kate fits the archetype quite well, being a light in the darkness that is the entity's realm, being one of the very few who actually escaped the entity's clutches. So yeah, I like it. Sadly, I couldn't think of too much when it comes to Jeff. I really like him, but the archetype-wise, there's no much going on. Punk would have made a solid choice, but Nia has it, and the other music-based archetypes have been taken by other survivors, so I ended up deciding on Archfiend, specifically Red Eye's Archfiend. The idea of the archetype is the monsters in the archetype look like things you would see in old metal albums, and someone who personally loves power metal, I can attribute the feeling as well. Archfiend's a really fucking cool dude. Adam is a teacher who loves Japanese culture, eventually coming to Japan to teach. It's obvious he has a deep love for the culture, and for that reason, I decided a rogue archetype that I personally really like, being super heavy samurai. They're unique cards and are based off of the legend of Benkei. I believe if Adam knew that, he would love these cards just that bit more. And other cards based off of Japanese culture, like the Karakuri, could work, but personally, I think this works just that bit more. For Jane Romero, I wanted to go with the part in her lore. She wants to be an actor. She is a talk show host and almost every day performs for an audience. So I decided that the Perform Mage works decently well for a concept. However, it's still a yellow as their acts are more circus themed rather than movie roles. Ash Williams almost ends the world in his show twice and summons the Kandarian demons while saying sweet poetry, high on his mind, and doing less than holy things while in his trailer truck. For that reason, he should without a doubt have the archetype end of the world, as it's always happening when he's around, and he kinda does it a lot, let's be honest. Also, we can agree to disagree on this, but this is probably me just being a big Ash man, but he's Exodia, and I don't make the rules, he just is, alright? For this next section, I want to put all of the Stranger Things characters here. They're all red, and if you have any ideas in the comment section, please let me know. but from help of my friends and some additional reading, what I've decided with is Nancy is a good markswoman and uses them in the later seasons, so she would have the Burrow archetype. I could only imagine how Vecna would react seeing her bring out a giant fucking dragon made out of guns, and it's also a pretty cool archetype. For Steve, it's pretty cheap, but it's also a funny one, that being Ice Barrier. Why? Because Scoops Ahoy is an ice cream shop, good enough for me. For Dustin, I ended up liking the idea of scrap monsters. From what I've been told, he's the techie type of guy, so the idea of him using scrap to create things works well in my mind. And finally, 11, the only one that has something going for it, because she was given Dark Magician. If we talk D&D terms, her being a psychic like Vecna, she would be considered a sorcerer in a D&D campaign. And that is what a Dark Magician is. And while there are other Magician archetypes, I personally think the more dark side of magic that the Dark Magicians represent works better with what happened at Hawkins. But once again, I haven't watched the show, and I know that I'm a LARPer, so if you have any ideas, just let me know. Yui had a very easy one, as once more there is an archetype of bikers, and while the FA and Speedroid could have worked a little, ultimately it's goblin bikers. Yes, once more, the goblins are here to be looking cool as hell and working well with a character. Now it is yellow for me because it does not fit her lore, but they're just bikers, but I don't know, man, I like these. I just like these dudes. I like goblins, they're pretty cool. Sadly, Zarina is a red for me. As I said for Tap, there's no real detectives or reporter archetypes that I could honestly find, so I gave her Time Thief, only due to the mystery of the archetype that led to a girl being misplaced from time and creating devices to hop between it. But even then, it's like even barely a correlation with Zarina. I just know there's an archetype that fits her, but I just can't find it. Cheryl has easily one of the coolest concepts for an archetype, fitting one of the Dark Signers from 5Ds, as the Earthbound Immortals are evil gods sealed away, being unleashed once more onto the world by human vessels that summon them through cards to destroy the world. Cheryl has a god inside of her, which, if freed, would bring chaos upon the world. While to different extremes, especially on Cheryl's side, I do like the parallel that can be brought with the two deities. It also helps that other than them, I cannot think of anything else, so Earthbound Immortals it is. Felix in his lore is an architect, so I knew it was going to have something with machines. Sadly, going through all of my choices, nothing really fitted. That was until I realized that the ancient gears have a lot of rustic buildings and cranes and battleships, and really was the closest archetype I could think of. I personally really like it, so in the end, it's maybe a yellow, but he's got a pretty sick archetype when it doesn't brick, of course. Elodie's one is a little meta, but I think it does fit the archetype, which is Burning Abyss. This archetype is based on the Divine Comedy, specifically Purgatorio, as Dante himself is the main character of this archetype going through hell. This can contrast the hell Elodie went through to find the Black Veil, and the summoned conclusion of what happened to her parents, but unlike Dante, who had divine protection, she wasn't as lucky, being sent to the entity's realm. I guess you can say a god was overlooking her, just not the one that she would want. I talked a little bit about Yunjin earlier in the video, but her archetype is Live Twins, as is a sub-archetype of the Trickster's Evil Twins, and it fits both of them. Yunjin, being his producer, had an idea of what Trickster was doing and let it happen, allowing all of the fame and adoration for others cloud her judgment, until it was her on the chopping block. This archetype for her is the representation of her covering up the evil that the Trickster did by presenting him as just another K-pop idol. For Resident Evil, I wanted to group them all together like I did with Stranger Things. Sadly, there was also another group that was just really hard to decide on archetypes, as there's not too much to go off of, and only touch the surface except for maybe one of them. For Jill, she has the Ally of Justice. This archetype spans a group of warriors fighting the worms. I mentioned them previously, and they're actually a world-conquering hive mind. And 4 different bands of hero groups merge into one, calling themselves the Allies of Justice. Or in this case, STARS, if you want to get meta with it, and that's what I'm going to do. Other than that, Jill having a strong sense of justice, that's all there is going with this connection. Leon, being a police officer in the second game, has the archetype Goyo. They're based off of Edo period police and would have a strong sense of justice. In fact, Goyo Guardian was so strong it had to be errated to not have to be banned. But that's it for the comparisons. For Rebecca, she was easily the hardest, but I ended up going with her, being a field medic, giving her a row mage. The archetype is quite simple. The difference between you and your opponent's life points lets you activate effects while keeping yourself healthy, fitting the role of a medic, and that's honestly kind of it. For Ada Wong, however, it was really easy since her role in Resident Evil is being a spy. She would have a deck literally based off of spies being spy rule. They're quite strong as well, so I think that she would love to use something like that. She's the only real one that I'm confident on, the rest are going to be reds easily. Michaela is an inspiring mage and is able to use boons in the game for her archetype. It was also between mages and wizards, but then I thought about it and remembered there's an archetype specifically for spellbooks, and because of that, and that's what she's going to get. And it's a pretty strong archetype too, well, back in the day at least, I'm not too sure about nowadays. Jonah is a part of the CIA, specifically in code cracking. In fact, that code cracking eventually led him into the entity's realm, but since he's a part of the CIA, I thought that the perfect archetype for him would be the Phantom Force, which is invisible fucking fighter jets that have tokens that make them into smaller, cooler jets, and they just fucking kill your opponents until they die. Yeah, I like this archetype, I'll be honest, and I think he would too. Yuichi is based off of the kid in the original Ringu film, but all grown up. The only real lore that we do know about him is from the bio that the game gives us, but in that we know that he went into marine biology, so we got a whole range of water archetypes to choose from, and I ended up deciding on my personal favourite, Mermail. But it's going to be a yellow since the fact that it's the Yu-Gi-Oh equivalent of Atlantis is the only true correlation. Hattie in her lore was going out of her way to search for the entity itself. Compared to most survivors, she had some level of knowledge of the creature, and has her own powers, at least it's hinted that's the case. And for that reason, an archetype about outer gods and eldritch level beings just makes sense for her. In Vittorio's lore, he is a noble, but more importantly for his archetype, he likes to find mysterious artifacts that have possible magical abilities. We know he has some form of magical powers from his tattoos on his body and the perk potential energy, and an archetype that works with both those facts is, funny enough, Artifact. They're big weapons and have some form of spiritual power with creatures inside of them, which, it just kind of works in my opinion. Thalita and Renato are one of the very few where I wanted to specifically use archetypes that work together in a duel, so they can go to a local and tag team together to have some fun. Now after looking at some, I went with the one I personally like the most, and that's the A to Z archetype. One of them would have ABC, and the other one would have XYZ. I love these little union goobers, and they've gotten some more recent support, making them way stronger. And with the power of twins, they can combine to make a rather disappointing boss monster, but it's still pretty cool. But any tag team decks would work. Sadly, there is no Kite archetypes, only a guy named Kite. Mr. It wasn't supposed to harm the crew, Gabriel, was a hard one to choose. I knew it would be some form of machine deck, as he's an engineer from his lore, so I went for something that seems rather futuristic, being Cyber Dragon. And if you want with pure original Cyber Dragons, it would work even better, because back in the GX era of the card game, one of the big strats you would do is use cards like Limit Remover or Power Bond to get massive damage while sacrificing your own monster and your life points, and it fits the whole Singularity being a monster they couldn't control, but it could just be me imagining things again, but I do like the idea of it. Nicolas Cage had one of the easiest choices when I found out about the archetype, and that archetype is Abyss Actors. While they're mainly focused on stage plays rather than movie acting, the cards are based off of the character tropes you'd see in shows and movies. If I had to choose, Cage would easily be the funky comedian. Ellen Ripley sadly has no real archetypes that work with her, so instead of just trying to make one work, I decided to have her archetype based on a scene in the film, and that is the Machina archetype, full of bipedal mechas with cool ass weapons and high attack. They would easily tear up a Xenomorph. Alan Wake was a super obvious one for me after not thinking about it for a good while, and simply, he is the champion of light, and the Lightsworn are warriors of light protecting the innocent and being guided by the Judgment Dragon. While I doubt Alan Wake is controlled by a dragon, that's still cool as shit. From what we know in Sable's lore and the promotional material, she was exploring a mystery which we can assume is the unknown, and what she eventually led to her entering the realm, the same realm that took her friend Michaela. She even hosted a podcast talking about her findings, and that inspired me to decide that her archetype would be Danger. The archetype is fairly simple, just all forms of cryptids, both big and small, dangerous to friendly. A witchy archetype would also work, but I like how this ties into her hobbies more than her overall aesthetic. The troupe are traditional D&D bards who perform musicals and do all sorts of acts to bring inspiration to their party. Since most of the musical characters have been taken already, what's left for us is to really go into that performing angle with an archetype called Performer Pals. While they're more circus performers, I like how it loosely ties, but of course, it's going to be yellow. Laura had probably the simplest idea for an archetype. She's an explorer, so it'd be some form of either ruins or artifacts. However, obviously Victoria has taken the artifact archetype, but who cares about that, because this crystal skull is home from the Chronomaly archetype, filled with all sorts of artifacts or relics like the Moai. It fits quite well for an explorer like her. The Belmont clan are a home of mostly nobles, which made the fact that the noble knights are a thing so much easier to decide for them. Sadly, there is no real vampire slayers in this archetype, so we just gotta simply slap in the vampire hunter and ready to win. I mean, it also looks like Soma, and I like playing Soma. For Tori, there's some ways you can go with it. We do know that she's a part of a cult and she worshipped the entity and was almost willing to sacrifice someone until her slight hesitation sealed her fate in the realm. Personally, I like the idea of a Dogron. While the Egyptian deity is not evil, the card art in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is this black ooze with... Oh god, I like the idea of a cult seeing it and believing it to be an evil god and worshipping it while not knowing its true nature, but it's another yellow. Arella's archetype is so close to being one-to-one to her job of being an EMT, but just barely isn't. But the archetype is still a part of emergency services to save people, and that is the Rescue Ace. These are futuristic firefighters that protect people. Think of Promare, but way less crazy. And while they're stopping fires and not rushing them to treatment, they are both an important role of saving lives, so it works well enough. For the final part of our crossover, we've got another set of series I have not watched once. Again, a true horror LARPer. Anyways, from what I know about them, however, Rick Grimes was a former sheriff, and while there are not really any archetypes that fit that, Gargaga Cowboy is the only thing that comes to mind. I did find an archetype called Magiki, basically wizards with guns instead of wands, which worked well enough for me. And Michonne has the Shiranui. I was strong-armed into this, since the Shiranui, especially the ace monster, is shown with a katana, and from what I understand, she has a high proficiency with weapons, especially with swords, of course. These are red. If you have any suggestions like the Stranger Things, please let me know, because I'm genuinely specking for her at this point. For V, she's got a musician archetype called the Symphonic Warrior. They're just like living instruments pretty much. V, compared to the rest of the characters, was a part of a real band and is passionate about them and music, something you can see in her idol animations, and what better than to give her an archetype that is literally just musical instruments. And finally, K1. From what I understand from his lore, he is obsessed into making the artificial trickster called Mina, the legendary skin they added until that gold consumed him completely when the AI gained a form of sentience, and him and the AI entered the realm for the rest of their eternities. Now, listen, this is going to be very cheap, but the perfect archetype for someone who got attached to the Trickster is to give him the archetype called Trickstar. And the archetype does work for the most part, but instead of them being based on K-pop, it's J-pop. And personally, I think it works well enough, but it's gonna be yellow. And with that, we're at the end of the video. It was a lot of talking about Yu-Gi-Oh, huh? But we're not done just yet, as I've enjoyed myself when making this video, so if you did too, I want to issue a challenge. If this video can get 20 likes, I will do a continuation of the premise, but make them into real decks and simulate a tournament to see who wins. Of course, with some help from you. Because, like I said earlier, some of the archetypes just don't fit some of the characters. So if you have any that may, please let me know in the comments. And if you like this type of stuff or JRPG content, why not like and subscribe, and I'll see you another time.